Welcome to episode 89. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. And starting with this week's Industrial Roundup, and in particular with community health. Following the successful ballot of the Health and Allied Managers and Admin Agreement, we are now proceeding to ballot with respect to the dental therapists and the Medical Scientists Agreement, which covers dietitians, audiologists, pharmacists, and others. That leaves two agreements for community health, being the Dentists Agreement, for which there are some discussions with respect to funding, and the Allied Health Professionals Agreement. We're looking forward to concluding those agreements shortly. With regards to our health service members, and starting with the mental health agreement, there is an all-day training session with regards to the community workload management system occurring on Monday. There's also a meeting of the biomedical engineers reference group on Monday. The rural and regional HR/IR managers meeting is conducted this Wednesday. We're also attending a meeting of the WorkSafe Victoria Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Committee on Wednesday in Geelong. And there's the Doctors SDPPWG on Thursday, where I anticipate the continued focus will be on progress, working through the proposed draft schedules for the saved provisions applying to specialists. But as always, all of those activities will be summarised through the VHA Community app. And that's it for this week's Industrial Roundup. Welcome to the weekly update, where we go in depth with a particular subject. And joining me for this week's discussion is Senior Workplace Relations Consultant Daniel Pullin. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Stuart.
Daniel, would you be good enough to reveal the subject clue for today's discussion?
Of course.
So you may need to hold that one up to camera, I think. And for the benefit of those people who are listening to this podcast rather than watching, could you describe the object?
It's a VHS of Mel Gibson in Backpay, No More Mr. Nice Guy.
I don't think that's part of the title. I think that might be sort of the blurb, as it were. So first of all, let me say and record my how impressed I am at the fact that you can recognise the video at this point. It is indeed a Mel Gibson film. I think it's after his fall from grace, so the No More Mr. Nice Guy, that goes without saying. Originally that film, in fact, was called Payback. But we've amended that to say Backpay, and it's the story of a disgruntled payroll officer after receiving the public holiday matrix.
Right.
So on the basis of this clue, what would you say that the subject for today's discussion is?
Look, the surname Gibson, Gibson's a guitar, and I often try and guess that it is music therapy. So I'm going to go with music therapy being Gibson guitar.
Daniel, you couldn't be more wrong. The name of the film is Backpay, so we are talking about Backpay. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on Backpay and a lump sum payment for doctors in training and for medical specialists.
Okay.
Just to put that in context, we're really talking about some material that was put in a bulletin.
And I guess, yes, as you mentioned, today we're talking about Bulletin 2365.
2365.
And the guidelines attached to that for the payment of back pay for salary increases from the first full pay period on or after the 1st of January 2018, and the lump sum payment for doctors in training and medical specialists.
Okay, so this sounds a little bit like a storybook. Would it be helpful for people to read along at home?
It would be very helpful to read along at home.
So on that basis, if people had a copy of Bulletin 2365 available to them whilst they're watching this podcast, that might assist.
It would very much assist, yes.
All right, so that bulletin has some guidelines. How did those guidelines come about?
So to start with, members asked for guidelines. Also, there was some unusual circumstances that made it difficult to take the orthodox approach. So
you've referred to the orthodox approach in terms of back pay following the approval of the agreement. What is the orthodox approach?
So ordinarily, an employee needs to be employed at the time the agreement comes into operation in order to receive a benefit from that agreement.
So why wouldn't that approach work in this instance?
So in particular, doctors in training are a rather unique group of employees.
Why are they unique?
So it's an inherent feature of being a doctor in training that you move, predominantly in February.
So if changing employers disentitled a doctor in training to back pay, even in part, the terms that were agreed between the parties in the heads of agreement that they would receive a wage increase from the first full pay period on or after 1 January could never come into effect.
That's correct, and that would be problematic.
I'm also mindful that many of the doctors in training who do move from one employer move to another employer covered by this agreement, another employer in the public sector in Victoria. And in particular, I'm mindful that this is a single interest agreement. That is, the parties have been authorised to bargain as though they were a single employer.
And that's correct. And it would be strange if Public Health Services were agreeing to bargain as a collective or as a group, but not be so for Backpay.
So what are the other unique features?
So there were. So members would recall that an earlier part of the payment had been authorised earlier by way of departmental circular.
So having regard for that earlier authorisations, it means that the orthodox approach can't apply.
That's correct.
It can't operate under those circumstances. So what are the other sort of unique features that we needed to take into account?
I think delay. Members would recall that the vote concluded in March, with the agreement being lodged in the Fair Work Commission within 14 days of the vote concluding, but it wasn't approved until the 6th of August and then hadn't commenced until the 7th of August this year.
So that's really interesting. We're talking about a March vote and coming into operation in August. That's a much longer time than we're used to.
Look, it is. And look, so one of the challenges was how to apply Backpay in a circumstance where there was a delay in approval but wasn't attributed to either party, and certainly not the doctors themselves.
All right, so those are the unique circumstances that we needed to address in the guide. How did the guide come about?
So it began by developing principles that reflected a desire to ensure that the factors did not disadvantage doctors, in particular doctors in training.
And who developed the guide?
So VHIA, the AMA and the department.
And so I understand that the guide is underpinned by 4 principles as such. What's the first of those principles?
So that's correct. So there is 4 principles agreed between the parties. And the first principle was that doctors should not be disadvantaged by the long period that has elapsed between the signing of the heads of agreement and the coming into operation of the new enterprise agreements.
So I recall that the heads of agreement was signed in December 2017 and with the agreement coming into effect then later on the 7th of August 2018.
That's correct.
And we identified earlier the issue of delay in terms of approval. What is the second principle?
So the second principle was that where a doctor was in the employment of and worked for or undertook a period of paid leave, an eligible employer during or for any part of the period 1 January 2018 and 6 August 2018, the doctor will be paid arrears for the salary increases payable from the first pay period commencing on or after 1 January 2018, regardless of whether or not the doctor remained in the employment of such a public hospital or health service on 7 August 2018.
Okay, so the practical effect of that is that a doctor does not lose an entitlement to back pay because they've rotated since the 1st of January 2018.
And that's what that principle sought to address, yes.
And what's the third principle?
So the third principle was that where during a period a doctor in training undertook a training rotation to a hospital or other relevant employer that is not named in a doctors in training agreement, that would be what we would define as a non-eligible employer, that doctor should be paid arrears for the salary increases payable from the first pay period commencing on or after 1 January 2018, as if the doctor had been working at an eligible employer.
So that's an interesting one. Who pays them as though they were working for an eligible employer under those circumstances?
The parent hospital.
Okay, so they're still an employee of the parent and the parent is responsible.
Correct.
So that reads as an extension of the second principle, except that it relates to that rotation of a health service to a private hospital, for example, or interstate, I assume.
That's correct. So in this scenario, the parent hospital is responsible for the back payment.
And I understand that the fourth principle applies to the lump sum payment.
That's correct. So the fourth principle provides that the payment of the lump sum payment will be made to doctors in accordance with the terms set out in the relevant new enterprise agreements.
So I'll come back to that phrase in accordance with the terms of the relevant new enterprise agreement in a moment, but we've provided advice before on the lump sum payment in Bulletin 2297 and Bulletin 2319.
Yep.
Is our advice changing?
It's not. So both Bulletin 2297 and Bulletin 2319 provided for the payment of lump sum payments in accordance with the terms of the agreement.
Now, I said I would come back to that phrase, in the terms of the agreement. That does sound rather cryptic.
Yeah.
And I think that whenever documents are produced jointly, there is always the risk of some cryptic language. But what are the terms of the agreement in practical purposes?
So for lump sum payments, you must satisfy two elements.
And what are those two elements?
So the two elements are that you need to have been employed on the 1st of January 2018 by an employer that's covered by the agreement, and you must be employed when the agreement came into operation on the 7th of August 2018.
Okay, so in the context of the lump sum payment, you've got two boxes to tick to be eligible for that lump sum payment.
Correct.
So what do members do now?
So Bulletin 2365 does provide that health services will need to review the guidelines and proactively identify and inform doctors who might have an entitlement to back pay and or the lump sum payment in accordance with the guidelines.
All right, so the first thing that members should do is read Bulletin 2365 and the guidelines that accompany that bulletin, identify who may have an entitlement and inform them of their entitlement.
That's correct.
Is that all?
That's not all.
It's at this point that it feels as though we're doing one of those morning shows and we're trying to sell a steam mop.
Look, there's no buy one, get one free deal, but we have prepared a document which is attached to Bulletin 2365 that'll assist in the implementation of the guidelines.
Okay, and those are examples?
They are, yes.
Can you take us through some of those examples?
Sure. So the first example is provided on page 1 of the guideline attachment, and we would say that this is and would reflect the most common scenario experienced by doctors in training in the public health sector. This provides where a doctor in training rotates to multiple eligible employers.
Okay, so in this example, the doctor in training who has worked either with a parent or rotation hospital between the first full pay period on or after 1 January 2018 and 7 August 2018 is entitled to back pay.
That's correct.
Another example?
Sure. So the second example is on page 4 of the guideline document, and this is where a doctor holds an employment contract with an eligible parent hospital employer during the period of rotation to a non-eligible employer.
So what occurs if the doctor holds an employment contract with an eligible parent hospital employer, but the rotation hospital is private or interstate? So
in that scenario, the same principle does apply, but also where the doctor was paid less during that rotation to a private or interstate hospital that she or he would have been paid for the work performed at the relevant classification or rate of pay, as amended from 1 January 2018, that she or he had remained at the eligible parent hospital that they would have received.
So in practical terms, if they got paid the same or more, there is no back pay to be paid?
Correct.
Right, and the third example?
So the third example is on page 9 of the guideline document, and this is where a doctor does not hold an employment contract with an eligible parent hospital employer during a period of rotation to a non-eligible employer.
Okay, so the theme between those examples concerns the existence of a contract with a parent hospital that is the eligible employer.
That's true, yes.
And for medical specialists, I understand they're a little easier as they don't rotate.
That's correct.
And is an example specific to that?
There is. So the fourth example is on page 10 of the guidelines, and it provides that a medical specialist is entitled to back pay for all work performed within eligible employers from 1 January 2018 to 7 August 2018. So any work with a non-eligible employer during this period does not attract back pay.
So we're drawing quite a distinction between doctors in training who have a parent hospital who are rotating as part of their training, as opposed to a medical specialist who is changing jobs. And if they're changing jobs to an employer not covered by this agreement, they don't get back pay for that.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. If members have any questions with regards to Bulletin 2365 or the guidelines, who should they contact?
So we'd encourage members to utilise the VHIA community app or by way of email to the query team, query@vhia.com.au.
So that address will appear up on screen as we speak,
It will.
query@vhia.com.au.
Or telephone us on 9861 4000.
Daniel, that's terrific. Thank you for taking us through the back pay and the guidelines. I know members have been looking forward to that for some time. I think it's appropriate that perhaps we go and watch Mel Gibson in back pay just to see how it turns out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Mel.
Thank you, Mel.